When I first came across Carl Jung's fascination with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, I have to admit I was a bit skeptical. I mean, how does an ancient Buddhist text have anything to say about the human mind that we couldn't figure out today? But as I dug deeper, I began to realize why this text has captivated not only Jung but also artists like John Lennon. Yes, that John Lennon. His song Tomorrow Never Knows was actually inspired by this very book, and of course a little help from an LSD trip. It made me think, what exactly is this text, and why does it hold such influence over thinkers, musicians, and psychologists alike? Let's break it down. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is actually a Western name for what's traditionally called the Bardo Thödol, has this long, intriguing subtitle, The Great Liberation by Hearing in the Intermediate States. I know, that sounds pretty dense, but here's where it gets interesting. It's not just some mystical mumbo-jumbo about death. It's a guide, meant to be read aloud to someone who's either dying or has just passed away, a kind of spiritual map to navigate the unknown. And in a world where we rarely like to talk about death, I think there's something pretty profound in that. So imagine this, you're on your deathbed and a lama, kind of like a Tibetan version of a guru, is sitting next to you, reciting these words to help guide your consciousness through what they call the Bardo, a state between death and rebirth. It's sort of like purgatory, but not quite. The idea is that after death, your mind enters this state of suspended reality. You're no longer attached to your physical body, but you're not yet reincarnated either. You're in the in-between. Now here's where things get a little trippy. The Bardo state is full of visions, sometimes terrifying, sometimes blissful, all of which are conjured by your own karma. What you see, feel, and experience is shaped by the life you've led and the actions you've taken. It's like your subconscious is on overdrive, but instead of dreams, you're seeing the consequences of your entire existence. If this sounds overwhelming, it's because it is. But this is exactly where the wisdom of the text comes in. The Lama's role is to help you, as a Bardo being, recognize these visions for what they are, manifestations of your own mind. That way, you can navigate this state without getting stuck in fear or confusion. The goal is ultimate liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth, something Buddhists refer to as Samsara. But here's the kicker. During the first Bardo, you get this one brief, fleeting opportunity to experience something called luminous mind. It's described as an encounter with ultimate reality, something so profound that if you recognize it, you can achieve enlightenment right then and there. Sounds simple, right? But most people, overwhelmed by the experience, miss the moment and continue through the cycle of the Bardos. In total, there are 6 Bardos, but the text focuses on the 3 you experience after death. I'll walk you through them briefly. First, there's the Bardo of the moment of death. This is where that glimpse of the luminous mind happens, a brief flash of clarity as the soul transitions from life to the Bardo. If the Bardo being recognizes it, they can be freed from the cycle of rebirth. But if not, they move into the next stage. Then comes the Bardo of Dharmata, where the deceased encounters all these deities, some peaceful, some wrathful. Again, this isn't meant to be taken literally, but more as a metaphor for inner experiences, representations of one's own fears and desires. Recognizing these visions for what they are is key to moving forward. Finally, there's the Bardo of Becoming, the last stop before rebirth. At this stage, the being starts to form its next incarnation. It's said that the decisions you make in this Bardo will influence what kind of life you'll be reborn into. Heavy stuff, right? What struck me most about all of this is the idea that our mind is so powerful, even after death. The text teaches that what we experience in the Bardo isn't random. It's a reflection of ourselves, our fears, our attachments, our unresolved conflicts. And to me, that's a concept worth thinking about, even if you're not into the idea of reincarnation. I think Jung recognized this too. His fascination with the Bardo Thödol wasn't just about the afterlife. It was about understanding the depths of the unconscious mind. The text in many ways serves as a symbolic representation of what happens when we confront the unknown, whether that's in life or in death. So whether you're interested in the spiritual aspects or just the psychology behind it, the Tibetan Book of the Dead offers a compelling lens through which to explore the mind. It's no wonder that it's inspired everyone from psychoanalysts to rock stars. And maybe, just maybe, it has something to teach us about how we live, long before we ever get to the Bardo. The second Bardo, known as the Bardo of reality, is where things start to get even more intense for the Bardo being. At this stage, the being is faced with experiences and visions that can be incredibly disorienting, especially without the guidance of the lama. The text emphasizes that the Bardo being can't cling to their previous life, no matter how hard they try. The process of death and rebirth is inevitable. There's no going back. It's a moment that can be deeply unsettling if you're not prepared. And that's exactly why the lama's role is so crucial here. This section of the text is full of vivid imagery, describing what the Bardo being will encounter. One striking passage warns, "O child of Buddha nature, when your mind and body separate, the pure luminous apparitions of reality itself will arise, subtle, clear, radiant, and dazzling." It goes on to remind the Bardo being not to be afraid, no matter how terrifying or awe-inspiring these visions might appear. The sounds, lights, and rays that surround them can't hurt them because they are already beyond death. It's like being told, "Hey, don't freak out, you're in a different game now." And while you might think, bright lights? How scary can that be? It's really just the beginning. Soon the Bardo being will come face to face with deities, both peaceful and wrathful, each representing different aspects of their mind. Imagine this, a series of powerful deities assembling in a radiant mandala, a visual map of the cosmos and spiritual realms. It sounds beautiful, but also overwhelming. These mandalas aren't just symbols, they're maps of the Bardo being's inner world, and they hold the key to whether they can reach enlightenment. First up are the peaceful deities, who manifest before the Bardo being in a dazzling array of colors and lights. For some, this display might be awe-inspiring, even comforting, but for others, it could be overwhelming and terrifying. The text makes it clear that the Bardo being must not get caught up in these emotional highs and lows. The peaceful deities, with all their radiance and beauty, are not external beings. They are reflections of the Bardo being's own mind. This is one of the central teachings of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Everything you see in the Bardo states is a projection of your own consciousness. It's all you. The text instructs the Bardo being to achieve unity with the peaceful deities, to recognize that these images are not separate from themselves. This is a critical moment because if they manage to do this, they can attain liberation and break free from the cycle of rebirth. But there's always a catch. The Bardo being can easily be drawn away from this opportunity, tempted by what the text calls the dull path, a path that leads right back into the cycle of reincarnation. Then things get really dark. If the Bardo being fails to unite with the peaceful deities, they're confronted by the wrathful ones. These are not your typical angry gods. They are terrifying, blood-drinking beings with multiple heads, fangs, and flames surrounding them. They wield weapons, laugh maniacally, and seem to revel in chaos. It's like stepping into a nightmare. But again, the key is to realize that these terrifying deities are just another manifestation of the Bardo being's mind. If the Bardo being can stay calm and recognize the wrathful deities for what they are, projections of their own fears, they can still dissolve into the light and attain Buddhahood. But if they're overwhelmed by fear, this chance slips away. The text describes a terrifying transformation. The peaceful deities become Mahakala, the protector of the Dharma, and the wrathful deities morph into Yama, the lord of Buddhist hells. Yama is a figure straight out of your worst nightmares. Vast as the sky, he carries a wooden slate that records all of your past actions, your karma, while his voice echoes with terrifying commands like strike and kill. He's depicted drinking brains, severing heads, and tearing out internal organs. The Bardo being, understandably, faints from fear at the sight of Yama, and with that, their chance at liberation is lost. They haven't escaped the cycle of Samsara, the endless cycle of death and rebirth. What happens next is a kind of karmic sorting. The Bardo being enters the third Bardo, the Bardo of rebirth, where their karma decides their fate. Depending on the life they've led, they'll be reborn into one of the 6 realms: the realm of gods, jealous gods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, or hells. Each realm reflects the state of their karma, and the Bardo being will instinctively feel drawn toward a womb in one of these realms. As soon as they enter, conception occurs, and the cycle begins again. In many ways, this third Bardo is about choice, but not in the way we usually think of it. It's not a conscious decision. It's a pull, an attraction shaped by karma. And just like that, the transmigration process is complete. The Bardo being is reborn into a new existence, starting the cycle of life all over again. Now, it's important to remember that the Tibetan Book of the Dead wasn't just meant to be read. It was meant to be spoken aloud, recited to the dead. That's why so much of it is addressed directly to the O child of Buddha nature. The language feels intimate, like it's guiding someone through a difficult journey, which in a way, it is. The corpse is the intended audience, which changes how we read the text. Suddenly, all the warnings and instructions take on a different weight when you realize they're being spoken to someone transitioning through the Bardo states. The origins of the text are just as fascinating as its content. Despite being called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's not exactly a standalone book. It's actually part of a larger work, a series of teachings attributed to the 8th century tantric master Padmasambhava, a revered figure in Tibetan Buddhism. As the legend goes, Padmasambhava prophesied that his teachings would be hidden until the time was right for them to be discovered. When we look at the Tibetan Book of the Dead through this lens, it becomes clear that it's not just about death. It's about how we understand the mind, both in life and in the afterlife. It's a guide to navigating the deepest, most profound states of consciousness, and it offers a path to enlightenment for those who are ready to face their own fears and attachments head-on. So, to continue, Padmasambhava's hidden teachings, or terma, form the spiritual backbone of Tibetan Buddhism, linking each discovery of these texts back to a timeless lineage. The traditional narrative surrounding these treasures, as you noted, often involves the idea of Padmasambhava deliberately hiding texts for future disciples to find when the world was ready for them. These treasures weren't just hidden in physical locations like caves or mountains, but sometimes in the hearts and minds of future Tertans, those gifted with the ability to reveal them centuries later. A significant figure in the history of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is Karma Lingpa, a 15-year-old boy who, according to tradition, uncovered several important terma texts in the 14th century, one of which included the full collection of peaceful and wrathful deities, part of which became the text we know today as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. However, while this traditional narrative is widely accepted within Tibetan Buddhist tradition, many modern scholars take a more skeptical view, suggesting that terma texts were likely authored by the Tertan themselves, with the attribution to Padmasambhava serving as a mark of reverence or a means of establishing spiritual legitimacy. Despite its deep roots in Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has had a much more prominent cultural presence in the West than within Tibetan Buddhism itself. Tibetan Buddhists are often surprised to learn just how central this text has become outside of Tibet, especially in Western spiritual circles. Scholars argue that it's become something of an American spiritual classic, transformed and repurposed through the lens of Western esotericism and fascination with death and what lies beyond. A pivotal figure in introducing this text to Western audiences was Walter Evans Wentz, an American theosophist. Theosophy, which emerged in the late 19th century, was a spiritual movement that blended elements of Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism with Western esoteric traditions. Evans Wentz's journey to acquiring and publishing the Tibetan Book of the Dead is an interesting tale in itself. In 1919, during a spiritual journey through India, Evans Wentz acquired several Tibetan funerary texts from a British officer returning from Tibet, which had recently been invaded by the British Empire. Though Evans Wentz had a habit of collecting texts in languages he didn't fully understand, he was determined to unlock the wisdom within these Tibetan manuscripts. This led him to the renowned translator Kazi Dawa Samdup, who helped him interpret the texts. Interestingly, Evans Wentz framed his relationship with Samdup as one of a guru and disciple, even writing in the preface of his first edition, published by Oxford University Press in 1927, that he was acting as a mouthpiece for a Tibetan sage. However, scholars like Don Lopez have questioned this portrayal, noting that their relationship was brief and largely professional, lasting only a couple of months. Despite these discrepancies, Evans Wentz's publication of the Tibetan Book of the Dead had a profound impact. The text struck a chord with Western audiences, especially those interested in spirituality, mysticism, and the mystery of death. There was something about the book's descriptions of the afterlife and its step-by-step guide for navigating the Bardo that resonated deeply with those searching for answers about what comes after death. In fact, by the 1930s and 40s, the book had become a spiritual staple, especially in America, where it captured the imaginations of individuals drawn to esotericism, altered states of consciousness, and the exploration of the mind. This was further amplified in the 1960s when the text gained renewed attention through figures like Timothy Leary, who, along with others, published The Psychedelic Experience, a guide that was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead but repurposed to serve as a manual for psychedelic drug use, particularly LSD and psilocybin. Leary's interpretation transformed the text into a tool for exploring altered states of consciousness, tying it into the broader cultural movements of the 1960s and 1970s that sought to break down the boundaries of conventional consciousness and explore new realms of human experience. The book's ideas permeated Western pop culture, influencing films like Jacob's Ladder and Enter the Void, both of which draw heavily from its symbolic representations of death, rebirth, and the afterlife. The notion that the Tibetan Book of the Dead has become more American than Tibetan may seem counterintuitive at first, given its clear Tibetan roots, but this idea speaks to the ways in which religious texts can take on new meanings and significance when they are transmitted across cultures. As scholar Don Lopez has pointed out, the text is not really a book in the conventional sense, and it's not even primarily about death. Instead, it's more about rebirth, both the literal rebirth of souls and the rediscovery or resurrection of terma texts. In this sense, the story of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is also a story about religious authority, about who gets to define and reinterpret sacred texts. Throughout history, religions have developed mechanisms for grounding the authority of their sacred writings. In Tibetan Buddhism, this is done through the figure of Padmasambhava and the reincarnating Tertons who continually rediscover the hidden terma. Similarly, in Christianity, texts like the Gospel of John are linked to specific apostles of Jesus, while in Sikhism, the Guru Granth Sahib is seen as the eternal guru, standing in the lineage of the religion's 10 human gurus. Thus, the Tibetan Book of the Dead became a cultural bridge, transforming as it passed from one world to another, leaving behind its original religious context and becoming something entirely new, a text that continues to inspire and provoke questions about life, death, and what lies beyond.